Good morning, Professor Tootle.
Good morning.
So, as always, I leave my questioning to a little bit of surprise, or maybe not secrecy is not the right word, suspense, because I like to see how you think on your feet. I do have a hidden agenda with today's discussion, which isn't what I've told you, and I'm going to reveal it at the front just for your context. It seems like the world, I'm not sure about world, Americans maybe, or at least Coloradoans, are in some sort of non-alignment or distress, or it seems like we've lost track of our national purpose, but we also have some fear of not only each other, but also what's going around the world. And there's no hidden agenda on this. I mean, I'm 56, and the thought process that we could actually have a nuclear war again isn't something we've been thinking about for the last 10 or 20 years. Maybe 40 years ago we were in the Cold War. But even when I was a little kid, it seems like there's actually some potential that we could be in a really bad world war, nuclear, more so than any time in my lifetime, perhaps. Cuban Missile Crisis was before me. So that's kind of the overall theme. I'm hoping that you're going to be able to give some insights into what it was like to be an American, 250 years ago, and how dangerous it was. Or did we open up more freedom and possibilities to be safer, once we became a country? Or maybe what happened 100 years ago, or it depends on who you were. Maybe it was only 50 years ago. But I'm hoping you can give some perspective for us. So whether you're a liberal or conservative, or Republican, Democrat, or somewhere in between, maybe you can come up with a more cohesive national dialogue. I kind of think we're arguing about silly stuff because we don't have the bandwidth, or we don't even know how to talk about big complex issues. So the big complex issue today, in a nutshell, is the United Nations and NATO and war in Ukraine and a proxy war against the Russians. That's kind of we're going to see where the conversation goes, but that's what I wanted to talk to a historian about. Should we as Americans feel more secure in our lives and liberty right now, or less secure? I mean, what is going on in the world? What's your current perspective? Yeah, you can hang on anything you'd like to from my premise.
Should we feel more secure or less secure in our lives and liberty? So I'll say compared to the past or compared to other places. Compared to the past, we are safer than almost any other time. Life expectancy did dip for the first time. So in that,
it's just a COVID thing, right? I mean, that was a
COVID, opioid, suicide. There seems to be homicide. There are multiple factors there, but but if you take this as a kind of general era, we're safer than we were in the middle third of American history or the first third of American history. Compared to other places at different times, I'd say we're also safer. I think we sometimes fail to remember that the world in its sort of natural in its natural state is ruled by violence. And so with the establishment of rule of law, you also get an increase in the peace among the sort of average person. So compared to the rest of the world, certainly it's almost always safer to be in a place that has rule of law and administrative justice. In terms of the largest sense, we're safer now. Within that, if you dive and get a little bit more specific,
hang on tight 1 second. All right, can you go now, Professor?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Please continue. I think you remember where you're at.
Yeah. in terms of uh, uh, the recent past, say the last 80 years, the threat of violence is still present. The world is still a dangerous place. It's still full of dangerous dictators with access to dangerous weapons, in addition to the fear of conventional war with a large power like China. Russia is also a threat to the stability of the world, and terrorism still never really went away. It never goes away entirely. And what we have is the ability to engage in spectacular acts of violence that are capable of terrorizing large groups of people. That's ever present. But in terms of how you should live your life, if you're the average American, you're probably free from everyday violence. I don't know that you should organize your life around, organize your daily life around fear in the year 2022.
So things are, I mean, good and bad are so relative, it's almost meaningless. But compared to history, going back 750 years or 2,000 years or 10,000 years, or different continents, Asia or Africa or South America, North America, to be a U.S. citizen in 2022, is it fairly accurate to say this is a pretty good time to kind of do the job you want to do and have the family you want to live and the hobbies you want to do and the places you want to go and the things you want to say and the people you want to do it with?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's some things you might want to go back 3 years or 5 years, but if we take if we think of now as being the past 20 years, then yeah, things are pretty good.
So you do concur, though, that it does seem like there's a sense of doom all around us. If we don't win this election, then we can never recover, say the Dems and say the Republicans. If we don't make sure Ukraine wins, then the Russians are going to take over the world again. If we don't mask up and inoculate, everyone's going to die. Or, boy, the government's using this as a power grab and everyone's going to lose their freedom. It just seems like we're so melodramatic on almost everything that it seems like it's hard to get perspective, which is why I wanted you to kind of chat about history.
Well, I just don't think that's, in particular, in terms of the two political parties, I don't think that either one of them are addressing the things that are most likely to affect the long-term security and liberty of Americans. So I don't know. So I feel like that's sort of a false choice to say that you must vote for one of these two groups of people who are, and neither one of them are addressing the most serious issues that we are facing. So so
let's drill down into that, because that was the original topic that I wanted to talk about is Ukraine and how much money the American citizen, through a variety of taxes, not directly but indirectly, is spending in Ukraine. And we're doing it for assume a noble cause. And it's interesting that both the left and the right, and not just fringe characters, major characters in American society and the political system, as well as Elon Musk and others are coming out against what we're currently doing. But it seems like there's kind of a consensus that we're doing the okay thing by spending billions, but not actually going in ourselves. Why are we in Ukraine spending billions? What is that fundamental to the American character, to help ourselves and others have freedom and liberty and security? Or are we just kind of in this perpetual motion machine that we just keep reliving mistakes from the past? Can you give a perspective on that? You have a minor, I guess, in Russian history. Is this a or an emphasis. Is this important, or would you suggest we be doing something different?
Um, in general, the policy has been pretty good.
But we didn't vote on it. Aren't we in a war? Are we kind of in a war? Or no, we're not in a war. A war is a war.
No, we're not in a war. War is a very specific thing. Okay. But we are sending material and material support. I mean, the situation we're in right now is, I mean, you can either think of Taft's kind of dollar. It's a combination of Taft's dollar diplomacy and the Lend-Lease or destroyers for bases deal with the British. It's the kind of thing that we've done more or less for the past 120 years.
Okay, well, talk about that. Keep going through that. What has been the U.S. foreign policy for the last 120 years, and how do we execute that policy?
Well, traditional American foreign policy before Woodrow Wilson was always based on ideals and interests. So we would say unilateralism and American exceptionalism. The American exceptionalism is the idea that that the most important thing that we do in terms of foreign policy is preserve American institutions here and serve as an example for the rest of the world that representative government can work. And combining that, and because we have a different role to play in the rest of than the rest of the world, it means that we have to be free to act alone. Sometimes, when necessary, meaning that we might have a foreign policy objective that's actually different than the rest of the world, and we kind of have to be okay with that. And this is often described as being a kind of test where ideals and interests are both necessary but not sufficient conditions for action. So if something is in keeping with our interests, but it's not in keeping with our ideals, then we do nothing. But if something is in keeping with both our ideals and our interests, then we will act. And it was Wilson comes along with this sort of, the strange notion that it could just be our ideals and as determined by the president. But after Wilson, we kind of go back to a traditional American foreign policy based on ideals and interests until FDR comes along. And then it really, World War II does force a rethinking of American foreign policy because not because ideals and interests is a bad formulation, but just the world has changed by the middle of the 20th century. The advent of jet power, the aircraft, rockets, and nuclear weapons means that the calculus about what is in keeping with our ideals and interests has to change. So we have had more institutions, things like NATO, that are permanent security arrangements that we had previously never had before. As for how we choose to influence world events within that framework, our first question is often, is there something we can do, but with just talking? Can we ask politely?
And by the way, Professor, part of the reason I'm asking in the way I am is I heard a 3-star general yesterday in an interview. I think it was like with David French, or it wasn't David French, but it was somebody on, I think, the Dispatch or whatever. And he was talking about the 4 instruments of national power: diplomacy, information, military, and economic. And so if that fits into your framework of answering it, I think that would be great. I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so that's what I was saying it in a maybe more linear or simpler way, but I didn't say diplomacy, I said talking. So we asked nicely, and then we begin looking around and seeing, is there anything that we're currently doing that is incentivizing this behavior? And then I would say what he would call economic would be, I would say we first engage in passive economic influence and then active economic influence. So passive economic influence would be, is there anything that we can do that might nudge this in the right direction without changing policy? And then you start thinking, so if there's something that we're doing that's incentivizing this bad behavior on behalf of someone else, we should stop doing that. You know, are we selling oil to the Japanese as they are, you know, trying to take over Asia? And then if that doesn't work, then we can go a little bit further and start engaging in things like sanctions. And then when it gets to the use of violence, war, there are levels of, and I guess, you know, the general would mention things like propaganda and intelligence gathering and all that. But in terms of war, there is first, I mean, the very last thing that we ever want to do is send an American soldier overseas to fight in a war on the other side of the world. So if that's the last thing we want, we will do almost anything to avoid that situation. So
as an aside, by the way, and I assume you don't know this, but any guess on how many countries that U.S. military members are in right now today around the world?
No idea. I mean, we have some military members in almost every country, because any place where we have a diplomatic presence or an embassy.
Besides that, I mean, actually, at least a platoon or a station. Yeah, there's some Marines and embassies, but besides that, I think, would it surprise you that it's 80 plus places that we have posts or
yeah.
base?
I mean, you could have, that seems low to me. I would have assumed it would have been in the 150 range, but 80 seems possible. You know, so and in, you know, some countries we have giant bases, and then we also have bases in a lot of our own territories too, that sort of thing. So yeah, we got stuff stretched around the world, certainly. But yeah, in terms of, so if sending a soldier overseas to fight and die, an American with a rifle being the last resort, what we will always try to do is we will try to influence their behavior with economic sanctions. And then the next step in that is there anything we can do economically to help out other people so that they can fight, so that we don't have to fight? And this has proven to be extraordinarily effective in a lot of situations, because one of the things that other countries have is manpower. And we have things that can act as a kind of force multiplier, so that other countries can use their resources. You think about during World War II, the Soviet Union never made a single truck. All of their trucks came from us. They never manufactured a single drop of aviation fuel, right? Because making aviation fuel is really technical and complicated. And so we did that. All of their gun sights, all of their optics, you know, all of their radios. And Stalin would just give Roosevelt these lists of things and say, if you can manufacture this stuff and send it to us, then we can send more Russians with rifles at the Germans, and we won't have to devote any resources towards, you know, the manufacturing of gun sights, which we're really bad at, or making radios, or trying to make trucks, or trying to make aviation fuel. You know, we can't do any of these things. So, and Stalin would just give, it was like a shopping list that Stalin would give to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt would just take it and say, yep, you got it.
I don't remember that being taught that in high school or college. Interesting.
Well, some of it's from a book that hasn't come out yet by a guy named Steve Miner, but I've seen an early draft of the book, and it has a lot of really interesting anecdotes like that. I hope it comes out soon. Steve Miner is a Soviet history specialist, but you think about during World War II, we never faced more than 20% of the German army. The the Soviets were fighting 80% of the German army, and that allowed the United States and Britain and Canada and our allies to face 20% of the German army, while the bulk of the fighting took place in the East. I think the top 9 battles in World War II were, let me correct that. The top 9 battles in human history all took place between the Germans and the Soviets, and all of the top 9 battles between the Germans and the Soviets killed more people than all American battle deaths in all American wars.
So does it surprise you that I'm shocked? I really have never thought about it in that way.
Well, if you just think about it as, if you think of total American battle deaths in all American wars, or 600, maybe 700,000 total. Well, I guess maybe I overstated the case, because some of those battles only killed 300,000 or 400,000 people. But total American battle deaths in World War II were right over 300,000. And so the Soviets had 25 million dead soldiers. Now, the United States fights differently than the Russians do, but we tend to, in World War II, I think I should talk to Professor Brasino about this, but I'm very roughly speaking, we were about, we usually killed about 10 to 1, 10 of theirs for every 1 of ours. It might be 12, it might be 13, I don't remember off the top of my head, but even so, if you think about our use of sending very specific supplies to the Soviets in World War II, it probably saved 700,000 or 800,000 American lives. If you value American life, this is something that makes a lot of sense, because it means that 700,000 or 800,000 Americans don't have to die. And I place a very high value on American life.
Yeah, of course. So not that I have to interrupt you. So I'm hesitant by asking this, jumping up to present again. You may have seen my comments, I think it was a few months ago, that I said we should just kick Russia out of the United Nations. It just doesn't make any sense to have the United Nations, a mechanism designed to keep war from happening. I know that's kind of impossible because wars keep happening, but if they have a veto power on actions of nation states, and then they just break every convention and invade Ukraine, well, wait, why are we giving them that power? They shouldn't be in modern diplomacy arenas. Now, admittedly, this is my field of expertise, but so give me some perspective. What would be a better nuance for American citizens to be thinking about? I mean, we still support UN, or
Well, there is a, yes, one could always envision, something that's better. So before I tell you why the UN is bad, and maybe I should try and think of the things that they've done that are pretty good. For things that you're trying to coordinate where you're dealing with rogue nations, the United Nations can often do some good. I'm thinking in particular about things like human trafficking, international sex trafficking, that kind of thing. The peacekeeping forces, election monitors, the UN does more than just try to keep wars from happening. So,
well, fine, but why didn't the UN just go in and put in a peacekeeping force in Ukraine?
Well, obviously, and now that I've said why I think the UN is good, I will say that I once heard a commentator refer to it as an anti-Semitic debating society. And it is. There's much of what happens in the UN is a farce, and it does give a platform and a legitimacy to rogue regimes that that make it unable to fulfill the mission of international peacekeeping. However, you know, there on a certain level, like it's also a recognition of reality. I mean, Russia is still a country that covers a lot of time zones that has nuclear weapons, and so and China is still a large country. I think that we probably need to rethink the UN Security Council, and there are countries like Indonesia and France, and maybe even someplace like Brazil that have a pretty strong claim to being, or even Mexico. You know, in the next 50 years, you could see a country like Mexico even. I mean, what's happening in Mexico slowly but surely is nothing less than a miracle compared to what the conditions in Mexico were like 30 years ago. So who knows? Poland, you know, if Poland were left alone and continued on its current trajectory, I just, a country like France, it makes a little less sense. There are a lot of other countries that might make sense, and might have a pretty strong claim to be included as major powers. Yeah, I like the replace, one of the comments that just came in, which replace Russia with Ukraine on the Security Council. Yeah, I mean, even Ukraine. I mean, you think about what the resources that Ukraine has. There's no natural reason why any country should be, you know, more or less successful. You know, usually it has nothing to do with geography or natural resources. I mean, England's the size of California. You know, and I'd say it punches above its weight. So it is frustrating that the UN is not more effective.
Well, okay, so we'll switch gears. And if it's not UN, and you've given some interesting thoughts that I wanted to have occurred to me about some of the countries you've mentioned. That's interesting. Thank you. How about NATO then? Why are we doing it the way we're doing it? Why don't we just use our, you know, spheres of influence, all our tools of national diplomacy and power? Why don't we do a more forceful job of NATO? How are we going to unwind ourselves of this? Is this going to, I mean, are you nervous about a nuclear war, or tactical nukes, or no, John, there's lots of things to be nervous about, and that's not one of them. Or is there a better way to be dealing with this? We just elected you President Tootle. And now you're just continuing along with the Biden administration, and you're telling McCarthy to sit down, and you're telling these crazy liberal Democrats to sit down, or what? I mean, what are we doing? Are we on the right path?
I guess the first thing I would ask for is a security briefing, because I would want to know. I would want to know what he knows before I say anything. Because, as you know, the saying goes, the first thing that will happen is your hair will turn gray, because you will find out that there isn't one threat facing the United States. There are 100, and you're prioritizing all of them. And something Harry Truman said kind of always stuck with me, that or maybe it was, gosh, I think this was Truman, but he said all the easy problems have been solved before they get to you. Right. You know, the job of a president is to keep choosing between bad and worse. You're making a guess as to option one will kill 51,000 Americans, and option two will kill 49,000 Americans, and you have to decide, and you'll never know if you were right. You know, that's the kind of decision making that presidents also often have to engage in. So I try to be, generally speaking, unless we have somebody who's incapable or of bad character, I try to be sympathetic to most presidents and say, I bet if I was in their position, I would probably do the same thing. because in most cases, if you were faced with so the main thing that presidents can do in their decision making is make sure that they have a good decision making process, so that when a crisis arises, you've already made the decision, and get a good decision making process in place. And I think that that's often more important, because, and also just don't create a crisis. We've had a lot of presidents who come in not knowing very much and end up creating their own crises because of their own inexperience. And we think of people like Obama or Carter or Kennedy in that regard. A lot of unforced errors out of inexperience. But Biden doesn't have that. He's making very conventional mistakes. He's very much within the normal range of presidents making foreign policy decisions. And so I don't know that I would do anything vastly different on day one.
Well, so President Brackney would kick Russia out of the Security Council. I use all our force powers to say this is a rogue state and will continue to be a rogue state until there's some other change. And I know I can never get into Russia.
Here's the thing, Professor Brackney, or President Brackney, what you're actually calling for is the dissolution of the UN.
Okay, well, I'm willing to do that then. You just can't have rogue nation states have veto power or threaten to do no. I mean, the whole thing doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I'm not saying that would necessarily be a bad thing. I'm just saying make sure and check your bathwater for some babies.
Yeah, sure. Okay, fair enough. NATO, I would increase the power of NATO, and it looks like we're doing that. And when it's rationally possible, Ukraine should be a member, and any other country that wants to have freedom, whether that's in the form of capitalism or the form of association and speech, or the ability to control their own lives. Any country that would like to ensure that happens. I do kind of think we're in a battle of.
You think we're in a battle? Your sound cut out. Let me say where I might differ slightly, just in terms of like big picture. First of all, I've always been a big fan of of carrier groups during times of crisis, and so I've always jokingly said, why not 2 more carrier groups? And I do think that one of the biggest long-term national security threats that we have is our national debt, because even though we are increasing our level of spending on defense, our debt spending and our spending on just paying the interest on our national debt is swallowing up our federal resources. And especially in terms of some things that the military probably should be, is already, I don't want to criticize the military, they already know that these things are threats, but in addition to things like conventional military forces, and I don't mean necessarily just boots on the ground soldiers, but carrier groups, but then in addition to that, drone technology, and then cyber warfare. That these are both areas where we probably need to mindfully start spending a lot more resources. And then the other thing that we probably need to engage in more of, that is also being drained by our level of debt service, is international development. I mean, it's such a tiny sliver of what we spend money on, but one of the things that China is able to do is direct resources towards development. It's kind of they're in a way what China's following the model of what a lot of European imperialist countries did in the late 19th, early 20th century. They allowed developing countries to go into debt to them, and then they have an outsized influence over their politics. And it's allowing China to if they're not, even in areas they aren't taking over. I mean, for instance, they'll go into an African country and they'll say, we're gonna finance the building of all your highway system, and we're gonna set up a system of debt and repayment so that you can afford to have all new highways in your country, and it's good, and it's economic development, but it also means that that country can't cross China.
Well,
And
we've talked about this in another conversation, and I think you disagree slightly, but it is a version of the American playbook, right? Hopefully we have a better ideal, but we've been doing that for a long time. I mean,
well,
all the way back to World War II.
well, it's a little bit different in that what America has typically done is allow or facilitate private companies to engage in this kind of activity, whereas what China is doing is more like old school European directing these policies to take place. There's just a difference between allowing something to take place and then directing it to take place.
And I guess I got to interrupt you because again, my public school education, and I don't mean to criticize that. I mean to criticize me and my lack of understanding of public school. They tried to teach me. Well, American Caesar was not a made up name of what MacArthur did in Japan and what the Marshall Plan in Europe. No, we did it directly with taxpayer dollars to have them establish freedom. And our military around the world today is still based off that, isn't it?
In Europe, yes. In Japan, no. Okay. There was no Marshall Plan in Japan. We gave Japan almost nothing, and it is sort of interesting that the money was mostly symbolic. The economic recovery that took place in Europe versus Japan, they both basically took 20 years to recover. So yes, it helped, but it wasn't the determining factor, because just apples to apples, the British economy recovers in about 20 years. The Japanese economy recovers in about 20 years.
Let me give you two other quick scenarios, and we're going to open it up to questions. Whatever our opinion is on climate change, or formerly global warming, now climate change, most people think that there's a real issue that we should be thinking through, however that manifests itself. But then when we start to manifest that, my gosh, we stop, or put more regulations on oil and gas drilling. Gosh, gasoline's more expensive worldwide. And all of a sudden now everybody wants to throw away all our plans and regulations. Who cares about global warming? I can't afford to put gas in my tank to go to work. So it's kind of like a long-term planning versus short-term, well, I got to survive. Shocking. Humans aren't that amazing. I mean, it's kind of human nature to not be hypocritical, but have short-term, medium-term, long-term priorities, and sometimes those conflict. The same thing with COVID, worldwide pandemic. It could destroy the world's economy. So we put massive infusion of cash, borrowing from future generations to help make sure we don't go into recession/depression. Then shocking, a year or two later, we have inflation. Now we're all madder than hell at inflation, and so we want to take it out on somebody. None of this seems actually particularly surprising to me. It seems like it's Russians wanting to make sure their empire gets stronger after the fall of the Soviet Union. That doesn't necessarily seem surprising to me. Or inflation doesn't seem surprising, or rising gas costs. But the way we argue about things doesn't seem to be more sophisticated than I'm presenting it. I mean, it just seems like weird crap gotcha politics or something. Or, and so can you give some kind of historical perspective? You can either drill down to either of those other two scenarios, or just give a broad brush perspective on how we should be doing better in debating America's national security and our interests globally, and how to establish more freedom in America. Whatever you want to do, give us a couple more minutes, and then we'll open up to other questions.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is a failure of elite institutions. Our politicians and our university systems and our media institutions do a really horrible job of prioritizing serious thought about long-term security issues. But that is often driven by the perceived desires of the American people, right? Your politicians will say, well, I'll start being serious about national security when voters start demanding it. Then people will say, well, I'll start, we'll start hiring different teachers when the public starts caring about the teachers we hire. And media institutions will say, well, we'll start running more serious articles when you start paying for it, rather than getting paid by click-throughs and engagement on advertising. So there's some of the fault is on elite institutions, some of the fault is with the American people. But what we have in all of those areas is a lack of seriousness with regards to solving long-term problems. I think about, this is just, it's heartbreaking to see what's happening in my home state of California because of wildly solvable problems that could be solved with less money than we waste. California could be what it was. California could be, despite the terrible governance of California, we're still the fourth largest economy in the world if we were a separate country. It's just remarkable. But there's absolutely no reason why we need to not have enough energy, clean energy from California. There's no reason why we need to have a water shortage problem in California. If we could have nuclear power plants and we could have desalination plants and we could have modern sewage plants. There are technology solutions that exist today to solve these things that we're experiencing as crises, and they would all be less expensive than the unbuilt high-speed rail and the amount of money that was stolen from various COVID programs. It really is remarkable the terrible choices that we've made as a state. And the same is also true at the federal level. There's absolutely no reason why, when you look at the energy, the problems that we could have avoided over the last 70 years, if we had committed to nuclear power, the oil shocks, the oil shortages, the climate change issues, the deaths, the air pollution, when you look at the problems that have been created both at home and abroad, it's almost, you could say, the greatest missed opportunity in world history. Because if we had been investing in and innovating in that space for the last 70 years, the rest of the world could have avoided many of these issues as well.
So, Professor, that resonates with me, but you do know the short-term and medium-term memory of Americans. We had Rocky Flats nuclear weapon facility in North Metro Denver that was a contaminated facility. We have the Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, and the fear of the unknown. It's pretty scary stuff. And to say that's just too scary for us to mess with. And then nuclear powers, who take this stuff, and how do you know whether they're using it for good energy or bad, blowing people up, melting people? So you do know that it would take much better leadership than we've had for decades in order to guide us through difficult decisions. And so, yes, in hindsight, I guess maybe you're right, saying if we would have just gone nuclear, but no one was willing to listen. They were scared of 3 Mile Island and others. Right?
Yeah, and they were wrong.
Right. And so, but we're not getting better.
So I guess the first thing to do is stop making bad decisions. It seems like an important first step. It's like, how do we solve the problem with the national debt? Stop borrowing money, and then take in more than you spend. We want
no one cares about that anymore. I've been working on the Fix the Debt nationally for over a decade, and it doesn't seem like anybody cares about the debt. Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, you're the first person I've heard talk about it besides me in the last year.
Yep. No one's going to care about the debt until our economy collapses. No one's going to care. No one cares about energy until the power goes out. No one cares about water until you turn on the tap and there's no water. And then people are going to look at each other and say, hey, politician, why didn't you solve this problem? And the politicians are going to say, oh, whoops a daisy, you know. But it takes, you're absolutely right in that it takes a crisis to focus attention on these issues. But if you look at, I'm sure Jake can look this up in real time, but just look at number of deaths generating nuclear power in the United States versus number of deaths generating coal power in the United States over the past, you know, I don't know what stats you can find, 50 years. But when you start looking at it and you realize that it's insane how, you know, this is how the human brain focuses on shark attacks, you know, but grown-ups are supposed to say, listen, I get it. The human brain will always focus on shark attacks, but we're supposed to be the group of adults who, instead of saying, yeah, world, we should really be focused more on shark attacks and having news stories on shark safety, that you say, no, like, let's focus on what is actually a problem. That's what adults are supposed to do. That's what elite institutions are supposed to do. You know, I've often wondered about this, the effect of the baby boom generation, just having so many people all alive at once, because one of the side effects is that it was that all of a sudden we were listening to young people, and listening to young people is not always a great idea. Yeah, listen to them, fine, that's fine. But enacting their desires is not always a positive good. Part of what threw society out of whack when we got so many baby boomers was just young people had too much influence. I'm not saying young people should have no influence. I'm just saying that they should not have more influence than people of every other age group, and it's led to this sort of frustrating reactionary back and forth on any number of issues. We
finally have some viral material. Professor Tootle attacks the youth of America.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's the line from A Fish Called Wanda, where she says apes don't read philosophy, and she says, yes, they do, Otto, they just don't understand it. You can't, like, just because someone is talking doesn't mean that they're saying something worth hearing, you know.
Okay, there's lots of good stuff here to keep talking about, but let me ask one more final question. In a way, I'm oddly enough, even with the thought of tactical nukes or even a nuclear war with Russia, I don't think that's going to happen. But even with that thought in my head, you know, reading the current media, you know, situation, for some reason, I'm kind of optimistic about where we are as a species right now. Are you, you know, in world affairs, are you just petrified? Are you scared? Are you nervous? Are you medium? Are you optimistic? Or are you, where are you? I'm actually semi-optimistic that somehow we're going to get better through all this crap of the last couple decades. It seems like the pendulum has to be switching back to rational people talking about thoughtful things, allowing more people to just live their lives, have a job, raise their family, execute their free association, speak freely. I'm pretty optimistic. Can you give in the context of diplomacy and UN and NATO and Russia and Ukraine and war, can you give where are you, Professor? Are you pessimistic or optimistic?
Both. You know, I'm not one of those people who's I would just say, like, it's not true historically that progress always takes place. We've definitely had eras where things get worse for 50 years before they get better. And you think about the era in the late 19th century of so-called scientific racism. Things got worse, not better, than they were in terms of. I would definitely take the philosophy of the founders over the scientific racists of the 19th century. So
you're talking eugenics at all, right?
What's that?
You're not just talking eugenics. You're talking about the whole.
Yeah, but even before that, the sort of racism of what you might call bad evolutionary science that infected so much thinking in the not just, kind of, well, combined with the sort of socialist critique of freedom that was happening in the middle of the 19th century. And then you combine that with bad evolutionary science and racism. It really, you've got a pretty toxic stew brewing by the 1860s, 70s, and 80s that rears its head by the early 20th century. Or, well, I guess I shouldn't say rears its head. It rears its head pretty quickly, depending on where you lived in the world. So I just caution, irrational exuberance, that progress is not a straight line up. However, there are certainly a lot of things to be optimistic about in the world. I mentioned, I'd like to see places like Poland and India and Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Chile, and Mexico, all Indonesia, South Korea, Japan. There are a lot of good things happening in the world.
Cool. Well,
I'm not worried about Australia, New Zealand, or Canada.
All those are good thoughts, but I do move to strike your insinuation that my optimism is irrational exuberance. Cool. Let's open it up to a quick Q&A for the next 5 or 10 minutes. Jake, Bart, or Ben, giving you lots of things to ask a question about in a lot of different areas. So please jump in.
Jake, in particular, did you find out if the number of deaths in nuclear versus coal?
What I was able to find, like coal and nuclear deaths, I couldn't really find anything specific for nuclear deaths. I don't think there's been any in the US.
There you go.
And then it was saying in the US since like in the year 2020, there were 5 deaths, but I mean, that's got COVID stuff, but it's really low compared to like in the early 1900s, we were averaging like 2,000 dead in the coal industry a year.
So my point is, over the long term, you've got thousands of people who died creating coal. You've got hundreds of people who died in the oil industry, and you have 0 deaths in the creation of nuclear energy.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. Jake, do you have a follow-up question or one of your own?
Yeah, so I just had a question about kind of the Ukraine situation. Now, we've got the midterm elections in the US in like 10 days or something. I still need to vote. I've got my ballot. Anyways, if the Republicans retake the House and the Senate, what do you think the situation is going to be with Ukraine? Because you have a lot of these MAGA candidates who are being funded by the Democrats, by the way, to win their elections. They are saying that they want to cut off aid to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. If it happens that, the Republicans take over Congress and then we don't send any more aid money to Ukraine, do you think that Ukraine will fall to Vladimir Putin?
Well, since I already quoted Fish Called Wanda, let me quote some Monty Python and say that I think that the backbenching Republicans are going to end up in a lot of knees bent, running about advancing behavior. I think that what's going to happen is
Professor, hold on. It was Speaker or Minority Leader McCarthy who said that it's not backbench Republicans.
Yeah, he's not going to do anything. He's placating his base, which McCarthy, his district was just redrawn so that he is completely bulletproof. You want to see some gerrymandering? In order to draw up McCarthy's super majority district, they had to slice 4 towns in half, including mine. My neighborhood, just my neighborhood, was carved out to be part of Jim Costa's district. Like literally Highway 63 and 198 they divided the town up. And you would say, well, okay, if you're going to.
But you're in California, you're saying the Democrats wanted to just give him a secure district so he could be him, and then they get more power other places.
Yeah, it's making Valadeo's seat more competitive and making Costa's seat more secure. And it eliminated Nunez's seat entirely. So, it was, talk about micro gerrymandering. Like, I can't believe that Jim Costa is going to be my congressman. It just makes almost no sense. So anyway, here's what I predict. McCarthy is free to say whatever he wants. And so he is going to say whatever is leading the news cycle on Fox News. But he's not going to do anything that isn't. What you might get some symbolic bills out of the House, calling for investigations or calling for committees, that sort of thing. But it will be things that will do absolutely nothing.
And why is that, Professor? Is that because the American psyche is so strong, or the military-industrial complex, or because the global power? Well, why are you so confident?
Because I think there are still enough people who recognize the reality that what we're doing in Ukraine is absolutely the right thing to do, and they will engage in just enough theater to placate the news cycle, but I don't anticipate any change, no substantive change.
Ben, Jake, does that satisfy you? All right, and give a thumbs up or down. Are you optimistic or pessimistic on international relations?
Well, I like to say that I'm optimistic, but at the same time, I don't really trust our political leaders. So I don't think that they have the expertise. And a quote that I keep hearing from people is they keep saying like, oh, trust the experts, but then those same experts were the ones who got us into Iraq and Afghanistan.
Okay. So you have a little bit of isolationism I don't mean to say isolation because I have similar.
Call it intervention skepticism.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, we're similar on that, but I'm optimistic. Do you think I'm irrational, exuberant, Jay?
No, I think it's good to be optimistic. I like to, have a good outlook for the future, but I also know that people from my generation, millennials, are getting to the point that we're running for public office. And the fact that Gen Z is influencing the White House does not seem very good to me. I know more people that care about, like, they get their political information from TikTok than any other reliable source. Right. So I'm not very optimistic about voter intelligence.
Well, I can help you out, Jake. I'm an an early Xer, so we don't give a damn. Take a lead.
I do have a recent example. This happened yesterday in class where I was talking about to my students, and I said, "Do you guys know what a stump speech is?" And not a single student knew what a stump speech was, not one. And then I used the expression "red meat." You're giving red meat to your supporters, and not a single student knew what those were. And somebody said, well, those are just obscure old terms. So I did a little Google News search, and I said, here's an article from yesterday where a single news article used the expression, he gave red meat to his supporters at a stump speech. And I want everybody to understand how complete the ignorance is. They know absolutely nothing about American history and politics. And so much so that when given a newspaper article about contemporary politics, they do not understand any of the words. I want you to understand how complete the lack of content knowledge is, and not just among students, but among their teachers, because that's another thing that is often, teachers can't teach things that they don't know. And what is often shocking is that teachers don't know these things.
All right, Jake, I really do think we need to pull a cut quote or two from this. Professor Tootle, Act 2, Attack on Youth in America. Yeah, I mean, this is the only thing that will make us go viral. So anyway, if you'll help us out on that. All right, Ben,
contributing to the poison here. This is clickbait, poison headlines.
It hasn't worked. I'm not looking for it, Professor. That's an inside joke, obviously, because no one listens to our shows. Bart, you are up.
Okay. Here, I'm going to be a little contrarian in terms of optimism about world affairs. To be honest, I'm kind of optimistic about US politics. I think our political interaction in this country is going to settle down a little bit in the next few years. What concerns me about international affairs is that I think we're having like a failure of elites at the international level, particularly in very important countries. I think Russia is a prime example of that. I don't know why. Well, I know why. If you look at Russian history, and Professor, you're an expert on this. I've read about it, so I kind of know about it, and I'm curious about Russian stuff because my ancestors came from there. Okay, they actually came from Russia and what is now Ukraine. So I've got both things going on. But the reality is, Russia right now is pretty similar to the way it's been throughout its history. It's always been a warlord oligarchy. Very corrupt, in before the 20th century, they had the czars. They were extremely corrupt. They had a habit of starting wars that they couldn't win. And then they would get upset. Well, okay. They tried to fight the Japanese kicked the, what out of them. And there were people, there were powers before that did the same thing to them. So this is the same history that we've been reliving with them. China is a similar problem, and I don't want to make this too big for us to talk about, but I think the People's Republic of China is a major problem right now. I think they are going to try to rattle sabers much more than they ever have on Taiwan. I think the only thing actually preventing them from doing that for real is the geography there. Apparently you can't invade Taiwan from the ocean because you'll die, so they're not doing that right now, but they'll find some other way to do something. What concerns me is, what do we do to kind of prepare Americans for how to deal with all this? I mean, the Russians, I think we're going to stop the Russians from taking over Ukraine. We've already done that. I don't think they're going to succeed. The problem is that's going to make them more mad, more corrupt, and more power hungry. They're going to try to do something else. What that is, who knows? How do we prepare Americans for the reality of this? And I'm not trying to be like, having horrible, scary music playing in the background or something, but the world is not really in a good place right now.
I think one of the things that first of all, I don't disagree with anything he said. I agree, and I think one of the issues is we haven't really thought through what our reaction will be, and I haven't either, but because we're just getting to the beginnings of some of these ethical discussions, is how we will react to cyber attacks, because almost all cyber attacks come from either Russia or China. And what to acknowledge and how to respond. At what point does a cyber attack become a real attack? And I will just confess, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. And it might be one of those things that we aren't going to know until where that line is, until the Russians or the Chinese cross it. But I agree. I agree with most of your assessment. Russia, in some ways, Russia is going to be Russia and China is going to be China. But
okay, let me interrupt, Professor.
The X factor, two caveats. First is that I never want to say that any group of people on Earth is incapable of living in safe, prosperous, and free environments, because they can, at any point, you can make cultural changes and put in democratic institutions that back up those cultural changes that allow for any group of people anywhere in the world to become safe, prosperous, and free. That being said, those places do have some cultural challenges that would have to change before democracy could take hold.
Professor, let me interrupt.
Yeah.
You've said Russians are going to be Russians and Chinese are going to be Chinese. China's going to be Chinese. You haven't said Americans gotta be Americans. We've done like 50 shows and right from the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution to the amendments in a linear line of freedom and liberty and dignity, respect towards humans. And for some reason, I kind of think we've lost our way a little bit and we're all like mad about the wrong things. In order to get Bart's concern about global relations, I'm stealing your words from 49 previous shows. Americans got to be Americans.
Right. And this is what, if you can sort of combine what Jake and Bart both said, it's okay to be skeptical of intervention, because one of the things that as an ideological nation state, what we need to remind ourselves of is that we can't actually, and nor should we, change the world. But we can change our own behavior. And you're right. As I did mention in this show, American exceptionalism, right? Properly understood, which is the most important thing that we do in terms of foreign policy, is provide an example that representative government can work in the world. And that should still be our first priority. And then, okay, after we have done that, it's okay to look around the world and say, what combination of ideals and interests allow us to be a force for good in the world, while being mindful of our outsized influence, both military and economic.
Yeah, love it. Thank you for giving that. Jake, if you'll help me with cut quotes someday. Ben, you get the last word if you want one. Otherwise, we're going to let Professor Tootle critique or give the last comment, even though he just gave a great last comment. Ben, anything?
I've got a whole lot of thoughts in my mind, so I'm going to try to present a couple of them here. First off, I am so happy I retired when I did, so I don't have to fight the cyber attacks that are going on daily. In my profession, being in IT, and that's not my only profession, I've done a lot of things in my life, but there are two types of attacks: the ones you know about and the ones you have no idea have occurred to you. And it's amazing how the public does not know that. But I think, Bart, you and I are the only ones that lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis with duck and cover and that kind of stuff. And I'm afraid we're going to be going through that again if Russia continues on their current path of, we want to conquer the world. And I like to be optimistic about America, but the world worries me.
Okay. Reaction to that, Professor?
Oh, well, this is where I would just ask Jake to look something up that I try to keep in mind, which is look up where Russia is in terms of the size of their economy. Like do a quick
Less than 10%. I know that answer. US is 25%, EU is 25%. That's 50%. Russia's less than 10%.
Yeah, but sometimes if you look at the countries on either side of them, who they're slightly richer than this country and they're slightly poorer than this country, it's sometimes illuminating. So I don't know if it can, how fast Jake can type, but
Type's pretty good.
Russia is number 11. They are right above Brazil and they are below South Korea.
Below South Korea. Wow.
and then look up where California would be if it was a separate country.
Well, we know that too.
The size of the California economy versus the size of the Russian economy. Yeah, so California by itself would be fifth. So just to, the reason we care so much about Russia is because of the geography that they span and the fact that they have nuclear weapons. That's it.
Well, and nukes aren't cheap, so that means there's sacrifices and other things going on in their economy.
Yeah, but I mean, it's in terms of what's actually hurting the Russian economy compared to not having rule of law. That's a rounding error.
Right. Good
Yeah,
point.
California is right above the UK and below Germany.
Man, Jake, you're just awesome as a add-on to the professor. Professor, I know as always, I'm a little.
No, I need to take Jake with me everywhere I go so that I can say, look this up so I'm not wrong.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So, Professor, as always, I'm a little convoluted, but I'm actually trying to, what is that, funnel, or when you're
Synthesize.
What is it?
Synthesize, put together.
Yeah, I was going to say some almost Wiccan thing or something, but yeah, synthesize is better. Feel like what the average American citizen is thinking. I talk to a lot of people professionally and avocationally and as a hobby. And so I try to approach things in almost a layman's way. And so the questions I ask are a little bit convoluted, but I try to do it in a realistic American citizen kind of way. And I remain optimistic, bullish on America. I love America. And I realize we're just like screwed up. But I don't care because I still love America. And so let's fix the screw up, and so adding perspective or maturity or wisdom to our current dialogue is what I'm hoping these shows will do. And Jake, are you sure, is today really number 50?
Wow.
Based off of what we've uploaded, I've got a count. It says it's 50, but we have like 1 or 2 episodes that Tony couldn't find. Yeah, the missing
curatorial episodes that we were embarrassed to post or something. Yeah, I get it. Okay, well, we'll find those someday if they can be found. But okay, so Professor, I do want to do a show on America. And so if you're available next week, let's talk about the 50 states and the 50 things that we should be proud of, or, whatever. So will you start pondering that?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't looked. You're asking me to think about I don't know what my calendar is for next week.
When you do,
yeah.
When we do, I want to do a show on America.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about the virtues and minimize the vices, but talk about the virtues of the 50 states of America as kind of a thank you for our 50th show.
Okay. I like it.
Week or the following week. Fair enough?
Yeah. Absolutely.
All right, Jake, thank you. Bart, Ben, Professor. At some point, somebody's going to watch this and do something with it.
Yeah, if nothing else, it'll be like a record of my kids from,
Yeah. Well, they won't watch. Maybe your grandkids. It always skips a generation.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Professor, thank you. Have a great week, all. I really appreciate your time.
Yep. Sounds good. Oh,